And I think what I'll call out, this is one of my biggest gripes in the brain and behavior sciences, psychology, neuroscience industry, is the experts generalize too much to lay people, and lay people don't really understand that this is not an end-all be-all. And what I mean by that is, say, insert neuroscientist or psychologist who has millions of followers, subscribers, whatever, and they make a claim that a study showed, let's say, creatine can help with depression. Studies have showed that, and that's actually a true thing that has shown. But for a layperson who has not actually done academic research, they're not dumb. They know what research means. They understand what it is. But sometimes they don't understand how to extrapolate that data. Because if I'm insert neuroscientist, psychologist with a million subscribers, and I say that creatine can help depression, and a study has shown that, and say you, the person who's watching, who deals with depression to some degree, maybe not severe clinical, but you deal with it to some degree, what your first notion might be is not necessarily go buy a bunch of creatine, but you're gonna look into it more. But you gotta ask, first question is, what did this study even consist of? And this is not a shot to anyone who isn't, because I've been in academia, not to full extent, but even I have struggled sometimes keeping up with it. And it's like, okay, what was the construction of that study? What was the sample size? What were their measurements? Because let's say this hypothetical study, there was 20 participants, and the pretest measure was, let's say, a subjective depression scale, like say the Beck Depression Inventory. They took that, I think it's like a few questions, and 6 weeks later, after doing creatine on a daily dosage at whatever prescribed amount, they felt less symptoms of depression. You could say successful study, the power value, it was perfect where it needed to be. But subjectively speaking, how do they really know if they, like, now you can ask this, they may have done this. Did they look at the values of, did they eat better during that 6 weeks? Did they exercise more? Did they just overall have better things happen to them in those 6 weeks? And that's the problem. And I'm going to say this, and they may not like me for saying it, but psychology, mental behaviors, mental health is one of the hardest things to quantify. So with that being said, is if that's hard to quantify, how much can we weigh what we find? And it sounds like, Nick, why are you saying this? Your whole business is about mental health and performance, right? Yes, but that's why I always make it clear in all my posts and all my talks and everything I do, that look at it from a performance. And that's why I think I butt heads with a lot of people in my industry. I don't look at it the same. I look at it from a performance side. And that's why I think I do the things the way I do it. Because from a performance side, I'll say it's more of, what does this tell me in the act of my processing, or the act of my mental health, or my act of my mindset? Because if I just say, okay, you did a faster reaction time on a Stroop task, that's when the color is incongruent with the word, right? Red written in green, blue written in yellow, so forth. Okay, it showed that you process faster, but what most studies are going to want to say is that means X. You know how many times I've done conferences or just talk to people on here, and they want to say, so what does this tell me? And I'm be like, it tells you got faster at a Stroop test. And a lot of people in this industry are not going to say it straight out like that with any of these things, because there's usually money tied to it, and going back to business. So to say that, oh, this doesn't necessarily tell me exactly what you want to hear. They want to see, if you go left, you go left. If you go right, you go right. You go up, you go up. And that's not how, at least in the brain and behavior sciences, it doesn't work like that. So you got to be mindful that our outcomes shouldn't be the only focus. I want to see things like, these are some intangibles that I look for when I work with my clients, but I want to look at your disposition. How do you adapt when stressors change? If I do something with a higher cognitive load, how do you act when that happens? If you're stressed before going into the task, can you regroup and persist under that stress? If you mess up, do you fall off of the endeavor? So these are things I'm looking at. So if you can't tell me this or do this, that's a problem. So these are things I think we need to give more attention to in this field, because we're always stuck on the studies. And I'm not saying don't care about studies, because all the drills I come up with, the apps I've created, all that is based off of research. I read it in the study first. So it's not that I'm knocking studies. It's just the fact that it shouldn't always be, because I think it's easier to present it to the lay people, because if you don't understand this and someone with a PhD tells you, hey, X happened and we got Y, or Y happened and we got Z, you're going to be like, oh, that's how it should be. Because it's easier for our brains. If you want to get to the science of it, it's easier for our brains to even wrap our heads around it, right? Our brain is very good at filling in the gaps, right? So if we're told this study showed this outcome, we run with it, and that's what most of the market pushes in the neuro field or even in the psychology field. They're going to push what the academics say. And we can even get into like saying the internal versus external validity, right? If we do something in a more lab setting, or we do something with a lot of variables accounted for, it'll give us a good result that we can say this was the reason the outcome came, which is great. We want to see that. But it's like, are we researching for the sake of research? Because external validity means how objective can that be outside of here when the parameters aren't set up the way we set them, right? That's what we want to see. Can it be done in the real world? But that's a line that's very hard to walk in the behavior sciences. So that's why I think the issue is in this field, to answer the person's question, like there's a lot of things that needs to be accounted for. And I think it goes to egos that people got to understand, like, you don't got all the answers, Sway. Like Kanye said, I ain't got all the answers. Me neither. So that's where I think the difference is in the psychology and neuro field is that both sides got to come to an agreement to understand that we got to look at multiple things. No one side knows it all. I know there's obvious incentive to push or publish things that go in hand with what you're doing. Obviously, you're not going to make research and keep putting out things that show that your theories, hypotheses are wrong. But that's what it's about, right? So we got to make sure we dabble in to everything. So I guess to answer your question, that the psych field and neuro field can improve, I think, just by being more open to each other's sides, really. It's kind of, I always joke, I did this on the Mark Bell's podcast for back in May, and I joked this is like the East Coast, West Coast beef. Those who may be younger than 25 may not be too familiar with this, but there was a time when rappers from both coasts hated each other, and Tupac and Biggie, if you remember them, that was a big poster child for it. They weren't the only ones beefing, but that was probably the biggest poster child for it. And I think that's how it goes in the psychology versus neuro field. Like there's a lot, even in the psychology, let's just forget neuro for a second, even psychology, I see in that umbrella, there's a lot of divided houses, because I was at a conference for sports psychology a few weeks ago, and even there was people who were looking at it as, certain sides get tended to more. Like they look at more of the clinical side versus the applied practical side. And what does that even mean? Matter of fact, segue. When people say mental performance, mental training, mental health, I would ask you, what comes to mind? Because when I ask this question, whether it's at events, workshops, or just directly talking to someone, they have to stop for a second, and they usually don't have an answer. And if they do have an answer, it's usually relegated to maybe 2 or 3 responses. The general one I think I hear the most when they think of like mental health or mindset or performance, they'll say something alongside like meditation or box breathing, which is great. I have nothing against that. Then I'll think people say things like when say like training your mind, your brain, they'll say something like crossword puzzles, things like that, which is fine too. Or just general reading, just educating yourself, which is all great, but it's not as finite, because if I say, what do you do to be in shape to work out? You'll give me, I do squats, I do lunges, I do sprints, I do cardio, I do spin. I do all of that. See how definite those answers are? But when we talk about the brain or the mind or psychology, mental health, it's either crickets, because there's not really a clear-cut picture outside of, say, therapy maybe. And there's nothing wrong with that. I actually went to school to be a psychologist. I didn't finish, but I did enough courses to learn psychopathology and did mock sessions. So there's definitely a place for that. I always argue 90% or about 10 to 12% of the world's population will suffer from some type of, or should I say, deal with some type of severe clinical mental disorder, right? But what about the other 88 to 90% of the world who their mental health struggles, their mental performance issues, their brain health struggles will be from day-to-day stressors that aren't severe? We call them subclinical, right? Because things happen on a lower spectrum. We look at mental health as a spectrum. We talk about things like, if I go off the rails a little bit, we can talk about psychopathy, narcissism. We can talk about depression, bipolar. There's different degrees. We got to look at the frequency. We got to look at the duration, the intensity, the onset. Got to look at what the symptoms actually look like. So it's not just about, am I this or that? So for the people who say are dealing with depression and it's not clinical, but they still have trouble getting through their day because their mind wanders, they might feel like they don't have what it takes, whatever it may be. Who's serving that population? That's where, going back to Mind Body 1 week, by the way, for those who just got in, that's what we're trying to do. Because if I said I'm working with police officers who deal with trauma, they should probably see a therapist. But on top of that, what if I told them they did some cognitive work where it puts their brain under actual stressful scenarios and situations where they got to think under pressure, use cognitive flexibility, make decisions. They have to react quickly in a timely manner. And they have to do this repeatedly so it gets sustained, just like how a muscle will, right? I call myself instrumental muscle. Muscles adapt. So does your brain, so does your mindset. So why wouldn't we do that? It sounds pretty clear cut me saying it right here, right? But in practice, where does it really happen? It doesn't. It very rarely doesn't. And I think this other part of the gripe, going back to the East Coast, West Coast industry thing, is the practitioners who really do the applied stuff usually don't come from a pure psych or a pure neuro background. They get it, but they don't have the same mindset from the educational side. And I think that's an issue, but they get it from the practical side. And on the other side, the ones who really know the book stuff, the education, the PhDs, they get it from that side, but they don't put it into practice. And there's a gap that needs to be bridged, and that's where Mind Body One comes in. That's what has been my mission, I would say, for the last decade plus, because it's not one without the other. And I know it seems cliche, I keep saying it, and thus it literally is the name of my business, but it's like they have to be unified, and not just from the typical way of saying, oh, I'm going to be mindful in the moment. Like, we need to train your brain, train your mindset, train your mental skills. So not only do you learn these skills, but you learn how to apply them. You get put to the test doing actual tasks that require other mental skills, so you can test, reassess, see your disposition, see your mannerism, subjectively rate how well you did, objectively rate how well you did. If I can measure it, oh, you did 0.2 of a second slower last week, you got better. What happened? If I can narrate what happened, that means I can make sense of it and say, oh, this is what's different. And if you know what's different, that's the only way you can improve. So you see how we can bring this all together.